Yes.
Yes. Okay, first of all, thank you everybody for joining us. This is our last webinar for the winter spring series. So we appreciate you being here and appreciate Mike doing this presentation on this really important topic. One thing I'm going to ask is that everybody mute themselves. There is a button in the upper right-hand corner that says view that you can go to and adjust your screen if you want a full screen or a gallery. Mike's going to be sharing some information. He's going to have a split screen here. So that's just something that'll help you get a better visual. So tonight our presenter is Mike Graybell. He is a retired manager of South Slough Estuarine, can't pronounce it, Research Reserve. Was that from 1985 to 2013, I believe. Mike received his MS in biology degree at the University of Oregon in 1981, and he has co-founded and served on numerous boards to include the Coastal Oregon Marine Experiment Station at OSU, Oregon Solutions Program, National Estuarine Research Reserve Association, Friends of the South Slough Reserve Incorporated, and Coos Watershed Association. Most recently, Mike serves on the South Coast Land Conservancy and was a founding member of the 501 Land Trust focused on coastal habitats in Southern Oregon. And tonight, we're going to be really exploring the issue with offshore wind energy, which is coming up a lot in the news lately, so you're hearing more about it. And Mike has a lot of information to share with us. This is being recorded, so if you want to go to the C website, you can rewatch it. There's going to be loads of information in his presentation. So not all is lost. If you're not taking notes, you'll be able to find it. So there you go, Mike.
All right, well, thanks very much. I'm gonna get my screen share thing going on here. So if you'll bear with me in a moment, I will share that. And I'll do a couple more things here. Okay, and now I will do a slideshow. Okay, can everyone see?
Yes.
All right, the hope is that everyone can see. I'm very excited to give this presentation. I must say that it's one of the more in-depth preparations I've ever made for a presentation like this. And that's very likely because this presentation is about humans and how humans value and interact with the ocean. And for some of you who have seen any of my previous presentations to the Shoreline Education for Awareness group that Jan and I have been doing for the last 30 years, my field of expertise is the biology of marine life, seabirds, whales, dolphins, or coastal ecosystems like estuaries and seagrasses. But this presentation, like all the previous ones, is designed to familiarize the docents from the Sea Organization with the topic of offshore wind energy. And that's because the docents who stand on the shore and look out over the ocean need to be informed enough to have informed conversations about what the prospect of using the ocean as a place to produce energy holds. So to begin our conversation about humans, I'd like to welcome all people to the Anthropocene era of geologic time. This is the age of humans. It's also referred to as the Great Acceleration. And I see Bruce now making arrows on my screen. Bruce Abbott is making, Bruce Abbott is making arrows on my screen.
Hello.
Yes, sir. You've just made some changes to my presentation.
Oh, I wasn't aware that I could do that.
Well, anyway, are people seeing blue arrows and a blue line?
Yes.
Yeah.
Those are not my lines. It came up as Bruce Abbott's lines. Anyway, humans are making a mark in Earth's geologic record. And you can see the bottom axis of these three graphs is time and history. And there's geologic eras from the Holocene period across the top. And there's three graphs. The top graph shows population change. The middle graph shows the change in carbon dioxide concentrations. And the bottom one shows the change in methane or natural gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And we're making marks on the Earth that will last a long time. This conversation and this presentation is really about how human beings have modified the carbon cycle of our planet. Okay, those blue lines are unacceptable. So perhaps I could escape, and there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've changed the planet. So now what? We changed it and we didn't even know we could. But now we know we can change the world. So the big question in my mind is can we change the way things are on our planet to the way we want them to? And the bad news is that change really happens quickly in the Anthropocene, but perhaps the good news is that change really happens quickly in the Anthropocene. So our climate is changing very rapidly and it doesn't look good. And so in order to stabilize our climate, we really need to change, and we need to change quickly, right? Yeah, quickly, but only fools rush in, I think is the expression. And I came across a presentation of a man who was given a presentation about nuclear energy, and he presented this logical dilemma. The people are hungry, and hunger is urgent. Caviar and rice are both food, therefore caviar and rice are both vital to reducing hunger. And I hope everyone is smiling, but I think this moral dilemma, or it's actually a logical dilemma, shows that we really need to be careful about the choices we make. And the relative speed and the cost of the solutions are the important elements of making an effective decision or choosing an effective solution. So we need to get this carbon out of our atmosphere, or at least to stop adding it at the rate we are. So that's called decarbonization. And the most effective solutions pay attention to the cost and the time and the carbon, not just the carbon. So we've got to avoid the most carbon at the least cost in the least amount of time. And if we can find cheaper, faster solutions, they'll pull out more carbon per dollar or per year than slow or costly ones. So this presentation is about floating offshore wind energy, but there's many decarbonization solutions. And this presentation is about how we should make a rational decision to identify the most effective solution. So I've listed in the blue square a number of decarbonization solutions. And as I mentioned, wind energy is one, but using less energy is another way of decarbonizing the planet. Nuclear energy is a low carbon or no carbon means of production. So is hydro, geothermal, and solar. But because this is about wind energy, and in particular offshore wind energy, we'll move to the green square, and the green square will be the bulk of the conversation, or one of the key focal areas. So we'll do a quick history and trends of what's going on with wind energy. Then we can find out what are the policies around wind energy, and then we'll dive into developing an understanding of what this business of floating offshore wind is. Can people see my cursor?
Yes.
All right, thanks. So I'll be careful waving it around. And then finally, once we have an understanding of what the physical characteristics and what goes on with floating offshore wind, we can start to compare it to other solutions, just like the choice we made for solving the hunger problem. So why offshore wind and why now? There's two major things are afoot. In this last legislative session in Oregon, the legislature passed a bill called House Bill 3375, and it's called to do a study. The Oregon Department of Energy, in fact, is challenged to do a study to identify the benefits and challenges of 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030 off the Oregon coast. This study is only focused on technical feasibility, and it won't evaluate social or ecological aspects of floating offshore wind. It's mostly a study about, is this possible and what are the challenges? On the federal level, we had President Biden issue the 30 by 30 executive order, which calls for the development of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And he's tasked the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, also known as BOEM, with undertaking this, a leasing program. And BOEM's mission is to make sure that there's an orderly leasing of federal waters. So let's zoom into the United States and say, what about this 30 by 30 objective? Well, this 30 by 30 objective represents just about all the offshore wind energy that's produced on planet Earth today. If we look at the blue bars, we can see that in the United Kingdom, China, and Germany are the people who are producing the most offshore wind energy right now. And the United States is definitely a latecomer with 42 megawatts, whereas the United Kingdom has 10,000 megawatts of installed offshore wind energy. So this is a look at the pie diagram of all those players. The United States is in this rest of the world category, but the world total of offshore energy that's being produced right now is about 35.3 gigawatts of power. But the United States is going to catch up and catch up quickly. So one example I can offer here is off of Cape Cod. Back in May, it was the first commercial offshore wind lease that was ever issued in the United States. And it took 10 years to get to a lease that was completed in May. It will involve 62 turbines that are 12 megawatts apiece. It'll be 15 miles off of Martha's Vineyard on the East Coast. And you can see down in the lease area, this is the proposed wind farm with the little dots, but you can see there's a much larger area for expansion in the lease. And this wind farm with those little dots is expected to produce 800 megawatts of power, but you can see that right now the current capacity is 42 megawatts of power, offshore wind power in the US. Another example happened last month. You probably heard this on the news, it's headline stuff. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management leased 6 areas off the coast of New York. It's a 670 square mile area, and it's estimated to produce 5,600 megawatts. Remember, our current capacity is 442 megawatts. It's in water that's about 100 feet, between 100 and 200 feet deep, and it's real close to New York and New Jersey that has 20 million people in it. So there's also, there's also room for expansion of this, even though it's proposed to produce that much power. Example number 3 is here in Oregon, and that's getting down to the nugget of our conversation today. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has issued a map in February that identifies these sites drawn in the black squares called call areas. Now, a call area is an lease area. It's kind of an area of interest. And so this is part of the federal territorial sea. And the United States Government Bureau of Ocean Energy Management thinks this might be a place that energy developers would be interested in. It's much deeper than the areas on the East Coast. It's 650 feet, and it goes out to 4,000 feet deep, out to the edge of the continental shelf. But it's huge. It's 2,181 square miles. But BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has a target right now, and they are on track to auction wind energy areas in this call, somewhere in this call area, that has the potential to produce 3 gigawatts of offshore wind power. Even though they estimate that that call area that's encircled in that black has the potential for 17 gigawatts. Now, this is not the only activity on the Pacific coast, because BOEM is also preparing several wind lease areas off the California coast. And California is slightly ahead of us on BOEM's schedule. So we've already been talking about gigawatts, or gigawatts, as they may say in England, but that's a measure of electricity. And 1 gigawatt is equal to 1,000 megawatts. And we'll be back and forth using these units there, but you'll notice that the federal government and the state government have really zoomed in on this 3 gigawatt potential. So my slides will make a lot of reference to 3 gigawatts, because that's what's in the radar of the federal agencies and the state agencies that are contemplating floating offshore wind in Oregon. So just to give you some comparisons, a single wind turbine can produce somewhere between 2 megawatts and 15 megawatts of power. If you put a bunch of turbines together, they can produce hundreds of megawatts to over a gigawatt of power. A typical coal-fired electrical plant like the one out in Boardman, Oregon, is about ½ a gigawatt, or 550 megawatts. The Bonneville Dam is 1.2 gigawatts. The Dalles Dam is 1.8 gigawatts. So if you think of 3 gigawatts of offshore wind, you might think of all the power that the Bonneville Dam produces and all the power that the Dalles Dam produces. Put those 2 power plants on a raft and float them out into the ocean and anchor them off Southern Oregon. And the collective of those 3 biggest main stem Columbia River hydroelectric dams is enough energy for about just over 4 million homes. How's a wind turbine work? Wind turbines aren't anything new. There's a tower that holds the propeller in the air, and the propeller is blown by the wind, and it has a drive shaft that spins an electrical generator, and the electrical generator sends power down to a transformer and out through a grid connection. These towers are tall and they need a sturdy foundation. And I will be talking about several different kinds of offshore wind, and I've highlighted the grid connection and the foundation in yellow, because that's one of the main distinctions between the different types of wind generation. The United States is well into the wind energy business, but it's onshore. As of the end of January of this year, there were over 70,000 wind turbines operating in the United States on land. But there were only 7 offshore turbines in 2 wind farms. Wind turbines are big and they're getting bigger. And I just picked 2 examples. They're getting big so fast that every day you see how these companies are enlarging the size. So right now, the largest in the industry are on the order of 12 to 15 megawatts, but there's 16 120 megawatt turbines in development right now. So let's go through a couple of examples of the different kind of wind farms. And I'll start with the one that's most familiar. I hope members of our audience have had occasion to go up the Columbia Gorge and see the wind propellers up on the Columbia Plateau and across on the state of Washington. This is an example of one of those wind farms. It's one of over 1,000 wind farms, 1,500 wind farms scattered throughout the United States. This particular farm has 220 turbines, and they're just over 2 megawatts apiece. The towers are 200 feet tall, and the total capacity of the collection of the towers is about 450 megawatts, so just about the size of a coal-fired electric plant. It's spread out over 39 square miles. Their foundations plug right into the ground, and the farmers who are producing wheat in that area plow right up to them and continue with their electrical production. And this example is one that's operated by Portland General Electric. In the United States, there's enough of wind potential. If we developed all the wind potential on the continent of the US, it would more than exceed the current US electricity consumption. That's information from University of Michigan. So as we move from land to water, the one thing that really changes is how do you mount the turbine to the bottom. And in shallow water areas, you just make a more elaborate foundation than what you made on land. And as I mentioned, Germany is a world leader. They have developed many wind farms. In fact, throughout the world, there's 162 operating offshore wind farms and many more in development right now. This wind farm has 70 turbines that are 5 megawatts. So these turbines, each turbine is capable of producing twice the amount of power as those ones that I showed you on the Columbia Gorge. It has a little less power, so it has half as many turbines, but it has almost the same amount of power as the one that was on land. And it's in reasonably shallow water, 130 feet deep. Those foundations are used, the jacket style foundation, and you can see the yellow at the base of the tower here. It's just a metal framework that sits on the bottom of the ocean, and it's attached to some pilings at the base of each one of those legs that are hammered into the base of into the seabed, and then they attach to the foundation to keep it from tipping over. And in the front here, you can see an offshore foundation or an offshore substation, which collects all the electricity from each one of the turbines and processes it and sends it via a cable to land. The fixed bottom offshore wind turbines and substations are assembled at sea. Here's an example now of a floating offshore wind farm. And the fundamental difference between a floating offshore wind farm and a fixed bottom offshore wind farm is the foundation that holds the turbines above the water. These floating wind farms are in water that is too deep to mount directly to the bottom. So large buoyant foundations are established to hold the turbine in the air, and then that turbine is attached to the bottom with mooring lines and anchors. The one thing that's different about floating wind turbines is they move around because they're like an anchored boat. And so the electrical cable that connects them has to be able, it's an extension cord in effect, has to be able to bend and flex and move around as the turbines move around. But similar to bottom fixed wind turbines, they have an offshore substation that then is connected to land to an onshore substation. So here's what one of these things look like. Floating offshore wind is a very, very new and emerging technology. It has a typical turbine with a tower and a rotor with blades on it, just like all other forms of wind power do. But you can see the foundation is very, very different. In this case, it's 3 steel legs that are partially submerged in the ocean that have big plates on the bottom to keep it from waving around. They're very large because, well, in this case, the example that I've given here for principal power off of Portugal, each foundation weighs 22,000 tons. The difference between floating wind and bottom fixed wind is that the towers are assembled while in port and then they're towed out to their mooring location. So here's what a principal power foundation looks like in the top left here. These are those 3 legs of that floating foundation. And as we go through these slides, if you get bored with my discussion, I would encourage you to play a game of Where's Waldo? There are people in these images that I will be showing you, and it's really important to get a grip on the scale of these things. Out here, there's a parking lot somewhere, and so there's forklifts. I looked for windows, that sort of thing. These things are quite large, is the point. And here is one that's assembled and being towed to sea. This thing just started 2 years ago. The first float was launched in 2019. And you can see the number of firsts that this Windfloat Atlantic off of Portugal has done. These giant structures are attached to the bottom, in this case, 300 feet of water, with these things called catenary mooring lines. The towers are taller now. We started out with 200-foot towers, and the turbines are bigger. We're now at 8.4 megawatts, where we started at 2 megawatts. This is the history of commercial floating offshore wind. And the very first one was established in 2009. The one that I just showed you, the Windfloat Atlantic, is this, pardon me, it's this yellow mark right here that was established in 2018 and 2019. So as of 2019, there were only 9 floating offshore wind projects. There were 16 projects, 9 in Europe and 7 in Asia. And most of them tend to be small, between 3 and 5 turbines. But this acceleration of floating offshore wind technology is happening very rapidly. This is what the scale of a floating offshore wind turbine assembly looks like. Where's Waldo? This is a good practice for Where's Waldo. But this is one turbine generator that's capable of producing 12 megawatts. When you stick it on a tower and put the propellers on it, the total assembly of the tower and the propellers weighs nearly 2,000 tons. And again, at 12 megawatts per unit, if we're going to be building a 3 gigawatt turbine array in the Oregon coast, we would need 250 of these. So these things are big. They're as tall. They're now 800 feet tall. So they're as tall as the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge. And when the propellers swing around, they sweep an area that's the size of 7 football fields. Here's what one propeller looks like. This is for an 11 megawatt turbine. And you can begin to see that the offshore industry has, in a way, outgrown the onshore wind industry. But overall, the entire wind industry is moving to larger and larger turbines. This is one turbine that will require it's one blade that will require 3 blades per turbine. And this is one blade for a turbine assembly of 140 new turbines. So that's the part of the offshore wind assembly that makes electricity. The rest of the stuff that doesn't make electricity, the non-turbine equipment, is called the balance of the station. And that's the floating foundation, but it's also those extension cord cables called the dynamic array or the inter-array cabling, the mooring system, the logistics of installing it, the offshore substation, and then the cable that goes into the land. So because the foundations are big on these things, the non-turbine costs account for 75% of the total cost of floating offshore wind. So how do you hold one of these things in place? I mentioned this is the catenary mooring line system. It's kind of like a boat anchor. It starts with a large anchor that's embedded in the sediment that is attached to a chain mooring line that lays on the bottom and then rises to a shackle that's then attached to a synthetic mooring line, like the picture shown here with the fellow. This is that blue line that's shown there, and it goes up and attaches to the floating foundation. These lines, in order for the anchors to work effectively, have to be 4 times longer than the water is deep, at least 4 times, and up to 8 times, depending on what the conditions are. So you get this drag anchor, a big long line of chain, and then the fiber rope that goes up to the foundation. Well, I did some quick math on a 3 gigawatt floating offshore wind farm, and 650 meters is the typical depth. So if you do 3 times the length of the water depth, which is the minimum, you'd end up with 3 mooring lines for each cable. You need an anchor at the bottom. So you need 600 anchors attached to 727 miles of mooring line and chain to hold 200 turbine assemblies in place offshore. And this is what one anchor looks like for the Windfloat Atlantic farm. That's, I believe, a 5 turbine array. So they needed 3 of those. So they only needed 15 of these anchors for their pilot scale commercial floating offshore wind array. This is the kind of vessel that's required or involved in deploying an anchor. You can see the anchor hanging off the back of the stern there. And this is, in fact, the vessel that deployed the anchors for the Windfloat Atlantic off of Portugal. Here's an example of the polyethylene line that is used. It's attached to the anchor chain. And this is a spool for one line assembly, one mooring line assembly for a floating offshore wind platform. There'll be 3 of these spools required for each floating foundation. And again, that's about 600 mooring lines over 700 miles long. So now we've got a turbine assembly that's anchored in the ocean. What we need to do now is figure out how to get the electricity out of it. And so we'll leave the mooring discussion, and now we'll talk about the cabling system that's required to receive the electricity and move it to the substation. There's 2 types of cable in a floating offshore wind platform. And the critical one here is this dynamic cable. The cable that sits on the bottom of the ocean can be buried or it can be anchored to the bottom. And it doesn't need to bend and flex. But these dynamic cables have special design requirements that don't kink or stretch when the wind is blowing the turbine around on its mooring. Here's an example of what that one of those undersea cables look like. You can see that there's these things called buoyance modules on them. That's to make sure there's slack. So instead of descending straight to the bottom, that would mean that if the turbine moved around, it would stretch or perhaps break. And so you need to have some slack in this line to compensate for the movements. And that in order to keep it from getting tangled up, you attach flotation to it. So it's floating in the water column to allow for the cable to move around. This is what the inter-array cabling layout looks like for a 50 turbine offshore wind turbine array. All these little numbers, WT1, wind turbine 3, etc. So this is 50 turbines, and this is pretty much the wiring diagram. The thicker the line, the heavier the wire is that's needed for this. This is the offshore substation that collects all the power from all the different turbines. And then this is the transmission line that's the biggest of all that sends it into shore. This is 50 turbines. Remember that the 3 gigawatt array will have 200 plus turbines. This is what a cable laying vessel looks like. And this is an illustration of one of those undersea cables. It takes a lot of cable to connect all these turbines to the substation. So I picked an example of a fixed bottom 1.3 gigawatt array called Dogger Bank in the North Sea off of the UK. And they used 155 miles of inter-array cabling to connect all the turbines to the substation. So I just did an estimate based on that, even though a floating array requires far more cable because the Dogger Bank doesn't require any of this dynamic cable because they can run the cable straight down the legs of the jacket foundation onto the seabed and over to that. So even at that, with a conservative estimate, I estimated that we'll need 350 miles of this electrical cable to wire up a 3 gigawatt array. This is what a cable laying vessel looks like. This is the cable laying vessel that did the install for Windfloat Atlantic. It's a pretty versatile machine. It can carry 5,000 tons of electrical cable. It's a pretty big ship, and I'm glad I don't have to fill it up with fuel because it has nearly 400,000 gallons of fuel. It can house 90 people. So once all the power comes out of the towers, we funnel it over to the substation. And I don't have pictures of floating substations because they're still in development. The only picture I was able to see was for a floating substation in Japan for quite a small array. But this is a picture of the example that I've picked of that German installation. And just as you would expect, for a power generating plant that is the size of Bonneville Dam, you need a substantial substation. And in this particular substation weighs over 8,500 tons. So, but this one is fixed bottom. So you can imagine what it would take to provide flotation for a 10,000 ton structure. Well, I was able to find a picture of a fixed bottom offshore array. This is a bottom mounted substation for a German wind farm called Dolwind. They have 3 different Dolwind substations. So this is one of 3 that was just delivered in 2014. So it's been in service for a while, but the figures on these structures are astonishing. These are some of the largest human-made structures on Earth. They certainly compare with the scale of structures that are deployed by the offshore oil and gas industry. It took 7 million person hours to build this structure. So I mentioned that floating offshore wind has port requirements and offshore wind has port requirements, but floating offshore wind has additional requirements because the turbines are assembled at the dock and towed to sea. The fixed bottom offshore wind is loaded up on vessels and taken to sea and assembled at sea. So the port requirements are very different for fixed bottom offshore wind than they are for floating offshore wind. But there's common features. You need to assemble the components. You need to manufacture the components. You need to move them on and off of ships. You need to have vessels that can tow things around. And then you need to have other vessels that can be used to go out to things, fix broken cables, do operations and maintenances, replace blades, etc. So port requirements fall into like a couple of different categories. The can do everything port are referred to as cluster ports. You can build those turbine blades there, you can build the towers there, and because you have those kinds of cranes and facilities necessary, these cluster ports can support more than one wind farm. And the structures that you would find on the shore side of cluster ports are highly specialized and purpose-built. In contrast, the smallest and simplest kind of port is a quick reaction port. Not a lot of special requirements because they're running crew and maintenance teams in and out. They may land equipment of modest size that can be taken out to an individual turbine for repair. But this isn't where wind turbine farms get built. Assembly ports, this is an assembly port that's in the illustration here. You can see in the bottom of the photo, there's a whole bunch of, these are the nacelles, the actual generators that will have the propellers attached to it. Tower segments here, other equipment, some blades are stashed over on the side. So you need to marshal equipment and then prepare it to be loaded up. Here's an example of a marshalling port up at Seaton Port in the United Kingdom. You can see this is a fixed bottom wind farm operation because the vessels that are used for fixed bottom wind operations are these things called jack-up barges. And the green barge that's in the bottom right hand here, you can see the bottom of the ship because those black legs with the red tops on it can slide through the ship and jack the whole thing up above the water. And that allows these cranes, the cranes that are mounted on the ships, to have a good solid purchase when they lift heavy things and swing them out over the side. Otherwise, if the boat is floating, the weight of the tower will want to tip the ship over. So those are called jack-up barges. And here's just an example of one tower assembly being lifted off of a heavy lift wheeled cradle. Here's an example called Greenport Hull. It's on the Humber Estuary in the UK, and this is one of these cluster ports. They started with a disused old brownfield port site, filled in 18 acres of the estuary, and built a massive high-strength concrete platform where they could stage turbine blades, turbine towers. They could do pre-assembly of these towers prior to loading them up on wind turbine assembly vessels and towed out to sea. Here's an example of a component manufacturing port. This is for floating foundations up in Finland. And here's another good Where's Waldo exercise. The parking lot is down here in the right. So these structures, these floating structures, these are the foundation legs that are being assembled are pretty large. So we'll take a look at this structure and we'll zoom into the next image. This is one of those structures that's being assembled in the winter in Finland. It's one leg for a spar foundation. And I'll just point out in the Where's Waldo mode, my cursor is on a full-size charter bus. So that should give you some idea. Here we are assembling a turbine blade on the Windfloat Atlantic floating wind turbines. This again is one of those European firsts off of Portugal. And I just put this in to illustrate that very specialized cranes are required to do this work. In the Where's Waldo, we got a guy down here at the bottom of the screen. Some wind turbines or wind turbine foundations have draft requirements that exceed the port capacity. So the foundations are built at a port, towed out on their sides, and then tipped up to be floating in the water. And then a large crane is used to lift the assembled tower and rotor system and mount it onto the foundation. And here you can see this is for a Scottish floating wind turbine, which is one of the newer wind turbine farms. They're floating wind turbine farms. But you can see there's a mooring anchor here, and this large ship is tied to that anchor system. So is this one, and so is this one. These three vessels are used to hold the foundation in place while this massive crane lowers the tower onto that, and people then go and bolt the thing together. This is going to be a 30 megawatts floating wind farm, so still not huge. I think there's only, I can't remember how many turbines it will be. But I have to say that while I enjoy large animals, I also enjoy large machines. But before I began this, I had no idea there was machines of this scale. This machine can lift 14,000 tons. So what the heck? That's pretty elaborate. Here's Windfloat Atlantic in position. How much does this stuff cost? There's really, I centered on 4 different ways to consider cost. How much does it cost to build these things before you can make one electron of electricity? And then once you start making electricity, how much is it going to cost you to produce it? And some of those factors involve, well, construction costs. You got to pay off your loans. And whether or not there's subsidies available for it, like production tax credits or investment tax credits, that's a separate discussion, which I'd be happy to have with you. But also, who's going to buy it? And who's willing to pay what you'd like to charge for it to pay off your loan? So that's one kind of cost. The other kinds of costs are called opportunity costs. And I've zoned in on opportunity costs for the developers of this, the people that are going to build and operate these things, but also the opportunity costs for the federal treasury. And opportunity cost is new to me. I'm not an economist, but as I understand it, opportunity cost is, what will it cost us if we don't do this? What will we miss out on if we choose to do something other than this? And that factors large into how we go. So let's look at those first 2 costs and start to make some comparisons. We know now about 3 kinds of wind energy. So I'll take you through the comparisons between that. So again, there's a difference between floating and fixed bottom. So stick with me here. Floating offshore wind is almost twice as expensive as the fixed bottom wind is. And remember that balance of system that I talked about, the stuff that doesn't generate electricity, but you need in order to hold the turbine in place. You can see for floating offshore wind, the balance of the system costs are substantial relative to fixed bottom. And that's in large measure because the substructure and the foundations of fixed bottom winds are much simpler than the foundations and the substructure for the floating wind. And the same goes for the electrical infrastructure is a larger total, but that's because more cable is used for the electrical infrastructure, even though it's a smaller percentage of the overall cost. And that's because substructures and foundations dominate the cost. So floating twice as much as fixed bottom. Let's compare floating to onshore. Floating is 4 times more expensive than land-based wind, and that's because the foundations of land-based wind are very simple by comparison, and also it's much easier to build things on land than it is to build things in the ocean. So now we can shift to those other 2 categories of opportunity costs. What would this cost us if we don't do this? Well, I got myself into looking at where does the federal government get money other than taxes? And it turns out federal offshore oil and gas revenues are the second largest source of income for the US Treasury, second only to taxes. So that means that in fiscal 2019, there was over $5.5 billion worth of oil and gas revenues and royalties that came to the US Treasury from the development of the offshore areas. So if we try to decarbonize our economy, that means, and we phase out oil and gas, that means the US Treasury will have a $5.5 billion hole in it. And I don't have to explain to anyone here that the Treasury is always looking for revenue. And even at that, we're still running up a fairly substantial deficit. So there's tremendous pressure on the US government, particularly the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, to find some kind of a replacement for that oil and gas revenue. And here's an example of a lease that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management did last April, or April 2019. And the total for this lease is $135 million. It's off the coast of Virginia. So it's pretty clear that there's an incentive for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to generate revenue because the president and the Congress are forever looking for revenue sources that can solve the problems of our society. Well, it turns out that these areas that BOEM is now leasing, this agency was built to issue leases for oil and gas development. And now suddenly, more recently, there's this wind energy. And it looks like wind energy is pretty exciting stuff because it happens in different places of the ocean than oil and gas. So it might actually, from BOEM's perspective, mean you could get revenues from oil as well as revenues from wind and really do a revenue boost. So here's an example of the New York Bight. That's the release. That was $4.3 billion for the lease, just for those 6 areas. So it's pretty clear that the industry values these things because they fronted $4.3 billion to lease 700 square miles of the ocean. But if you remember this pie diagram, the lease price of fixed bottom offshore wind, which is what there was out at New York, is only 4% of the total cost. So not only do they recognize that it's worth getting in on these leases, but they're willing to commit, or they see that it's possible to make a profit on a $96 billion construction budget. But the US isn't alone. Every one of the nations that are engaging in this recognize that there's substantial revenue to be gained. Here in Scotland, just on one day in February of this year, they signed $920 billion worth of leases. Okay, so this stuff is super expensive. Is it the best way to decarbonize the planet? We are trying to save the planet, right? But I have this question in my mind that's come from doing this research to say, all right, the shallow water of the ocean is being industrialized. We see all these wind farms being done. And we're going to mark the Anthropocene with these wind farms. Should we also mark the deep ocean with this? So is floating offshore wind the best way to fix the planet, or is it just this next phase of this great acceleration? And yes, of course, we can do this, but just because we can, should we? In the next 8 years, there's going to be 80,000 offshore wind turbine blades manufactured and delivered throughout the world. So I'm still trying to find out if it's the best idea. And in my mind, some energy is greener than other green energy. And just making the steel for that wind farm that I showed you off of Germany uses or produces enough of carbon dioxide emissions to equal like 50,000 cars. And that doesn't include the gas for those boats, the construction of the boats, all the effort that goes into building them and hauling them across the planet to install them. Wind energy is the most copper intensive form. I never expected to find this, but there's so much new wind energy coming in, and all this cabling requires very specialized cable. And so it's right now, it's over half of the copper that's consumed by an offshore wind farm is from this cabling. And if you look at the different types of wind production, the most intensive copper use is the floating form because it has all those dynamic cables and it's further offshore. Transporting the components is also just, for me, has been a real eye-opener. Here's a picture of 156 turbine blades that are being shipped from China to Spain. Of course, we needed to build a boat that could do that. And then it also, once you get to port, we have to modify our ports to do that. And in case you're wondering, in the Where's Waldo mode, there's a guy down here. And I couldn't tell which direction this vessel was going until I found another picture of it. So we were looking at the stern of it, and this is the bow of it. There's very specialized vessels and very specialized ports. And remember that which is the best option has a time component to it. And my findings have found that offshore wind projects have the longest lead times for leasing and development, financing, construction, and finally to the commercial date of operation. And there's been such a proliferation of this that there's going to be a shortage of vessels that are capable of doing this work. And in the US, there's this weird law called the Jones Act that I'll explain in a moment. So we might expect bottlenecks that even if things go well, if something happens to this ship, there's going to be a backlog of turbine assemblies that are waiting for some other ship like this to move them to their construction or assembly site. So this Jones Act is a unique piece of legislation that was passed years and years ago that says, anytime you take merchandise or passengers between two US ports, it must be done on a US built and flagged vessel. And it also has to be owned and crewed by US citizens and residents. It's a type of protective legislation that was passed years and years ago. But as of this year or the end of last year, there were no Jones Act compliant turbine vessels in the United States or anywhere. So I think when we think of time considerations, we may consider backlogs because there'll be a very limited number of vessels available in the US unless we change the Jones Act. So the other thing that's happening is all those 70,000 wind turbines that are in operation on land, they're coming to their operations and maintenance phases, and some of them are actually repowering. This is just a picture of some blades that are being delivered to Vancouver, BC for a Pacific Core wind farm up in Washington. And you can see that this ship is busy provisioning an existing wind farm with refit blades, and it's tying up port space that may actually slow down the ability to construct new offshore wind. So I started to ask questions and say, is the solution to keep making more energy? What if we use less? we're talking about manifest destiny here, and it got us this far. Should we just keep going? And so I looked at using less, but it's fairly clear that the energy producers don't have any reason to support using less energy. That's not what they're in the business for. Their purpose is to provide energy to supply expanded demand. And I found 2 quotes from some folks from Europe that just talked about that, because I'm not the only one that's wrestling with it. We won't have big ships for this section because this is a very decentralized approach to decarbonization. Gas appliances are leaky, and the system that produces and delivers gas is also leaky. So in a decentralized mode, you can simply replace gas, and different states and cities are actually changing their building codes to phase out the use of gas appliances. I ran across one study that said 3/4 of all the natural gas or methane emissions that happen from a gas stove happens when the stove is off. So you could use less and not have a lifestyle change if you just eliminated having a leaky appliance to cook your meal. The same goes for hot water heaters. I have an electric hot water heater. We're replacing it now. One of these hybrid water heaters that runs on electricity uses $114 a year to operate, whereas the one that I'm working to replace uses 4 times as much power to accomplish the same task. Here we are. This shows that incentive programs work. This graph shows what happens when the British government had an incentive to insulate your roof and your walls. And this is what happens when the incentive program is discontinued. There's a 99% or a 92% decrease in the participation of insulation. So as a docent, you may be engaging in a person to say, hey, they're talking about building wind off there. And it's very common to be asked the question, say, but what about all these cars and oil furnaces? They need to be converted to electricity, and that's a lot. Shouldn't we just say yes to all the above? I've actually heard a college professor tell that to me. And I said, well, then my reply to them is, well, what about nuclear? That makes a lot of electricity. And I almost universally get this response back, but I don't know, nuclear has a lot of big downsides. So what are the other options? Well, what about solar panels? While I was running math, I did the math on photovoltaic solar panel installations and found out that floating offshore wind is 6 times more expensive than land-based solar photovoltaics. Also, I found out that photovoltaic solar arrays on land use a lot less space than offshore wind does. And they're using less and less because the solar panels are getting better. This is what a utility scale solar array looks like. Both of these facilities are the same size as the Boardman coal plant. One of them's in a desert in Riverside, California, and the other one is over toward the coast in San Luis Obispo in California. Those 2 plants combined produce just over 1 gigawatt of power. So I just tripled the land area needed, and it would say we need 40 square miles to produce 3 gigawatts of solar power on land. And right now, the study area that BOEM is looking at off the coast of Oregon alone is 2,000 square miles. But I think and I've certainly heard people talk about desert tortoises and what have you. So if covering up the desert with solar panels isn't for you, what if we put solar panels on farmland? And Oregon State University has been a world leader in looking at this thing called agrivoltaics, and that's co-locating solar panels with agricultural operations. And they're finding out that there's a bonus for both the solar energy production as well as for the agricultural production. And folks in Arizona are finding out the same thing, that tomatoes grow better under solar panels and irrigated land. It's a win-win situation. So to sum all this up, if I go back to that initial logical dilemma, I'm comfortable saying, from what I know right now, that floating offshore wind should be considered the caviar of renewable energy. And if we try and put this another way, I've now compared floating wind to fixed bottom wind to onshore wind to onshore solar. And either onshore wind or onshore solar gives you way more bang for the buck for decarbonization. The amount of money for 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind could be used to install 18 gigawatts of land-based solar. So the wind and solar resources on land are far more than adequate to replace all the carbon-based electricity generation we have, and then some. Land-based is faster and simpler to build, to maintain, to decommission. You don't need special port infrastructure. This Jones Act doesn't apply. You can put it with agriculture or housing, and there's not a downside. And you can actually increase the productivity of the existing use. And all in all, it's just less resource intensive all around. So why is all the buzz about floating offshore wind then? And it's because offshore wind will stimulate economic growth. It will contribute to the great acceleration. And if you look at who likes offshore wind and who's supporting it, the list is long. The steel industry, the copper industry, the crane industry, trade unions, politicians, it creates jobs. Remember, there was 7 million person hours used to build that one platform. But I had to ask myself, are any of these people who are interests that like floating wind obliged to pick the most effective way to decarbonize the planet? Of course not. Should we expect them to advocate for some decarbonization strategy that's more effective than offshore wind? Of course not. So my question to you is, whose responsibility is it to advocate for the most effective approach to decarbonize if it's not these people? And so I'll close just by saying that pursuing floating offshore wind is more of an economic development initiative with a green patina than a rational decarbonization strategy. And just 2 days ago, when Deb Haaland, the Interior Secretary, announced the lease of an area off of South Carolina, she said the Biden-Harris administration is committed to supporting a robust clean energy economy. And it says, and it provides yet another excellent opportunity to strengthen our offshore wind industry while creating good paying union jobs. Not a lot of decarbonization analysis here. So I've thrown in some links. This was 1 day's worth of news. This is breaking news. This is actually an international renewable energy link. The International Renewable Energy Association is a really fantastic resource. And just today, I saw the press release that they've issued a status report on how things are looking for the energy transition. So where do we go from here? And some years ago, I heard that the heart of a healthy democracy is a lively conversation. And I hope that this presentation has given you some fodder for discussion. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. That was absolutely a lot of things to think about, and presenting different ideas. And wow, it changed my mind personally. We do have one question in the chat. Would offshore wind impact migrating whales?
Well, I was quite surprised to start to do the math on all this cabling. So we have 700 miles of mooring cabling, and we have 350 miles of electrical cabling. The mooring cabling is large and heavy and taut, and it droops down in that arc, a sagging arc. but the electrical cabling has that buoyancy in it. The dynamic cabling has a buoyancy, so it actually goes horizontally in the water column. There, our group, Oregon State University, is conducting research right now. In order to set these anchors that can go down 30 feet into the mud, in order to lay the cables, they have to do seismic surveys that use acoustic sounds. So there are sounds that may have an influence on whales. I didn't get into the biology, but there are a large number of factors that are being evaluated associated with this. And because the rest of the world has done some extensive work and doing the development, and these are developed nations like Germany and the United Kingdom, they're doing environmental impact evaluations. So there's a body of information that is building that address studies like bird collisions. There's factors that I didn't realize that will influence. When these rotor blades spin around, they have copper in them because they're lightning attractors. And so they need to have grounding stems to them. But as that copper spins around, it messes up the radar of ships. And so they're great big objects. And if you're looking for another boat, if you're a salmon fisherman or a tuna fisherman, which is, they'll be out in the tuna grounds out there, it renders navigational radar useless. And so the wind industry is now working with the navigation radar industry to say, how can we develop a technology that doesn't get confused by these things? That's happening above the surface. Of course, if you're sweeping a portion of the ocean that is 7 football fields in area, and you have 200 of those things, and you have albatrosses and shearwaters that are migrating from the southern hemisphere, they migrate along the continental shelf. It may not, there's vessel traffic coming and transiting to and from that for maintenance and operation. The cable laying operations while you're building the thing may have different impacts than while you're operating it. And it's a very complex issue where you start with a piece of ocean. The part that I read about these cables, they're heavy, and if the water is deep, if you just held the cable like this, the cable itself would be so heavy that it would break. So that's another reason why you have to put this buoyancy in the middle so that you're not breaking the cables. When the waterproof jacket on the cable leaks, the electricity leaks out into the water. So there's there's concern about electrical fields that sharks might be sensitive to. Yes, the list is long.
Yeah, okay. Let's see, another question. I just got way buried in here. Could you explain how to access the recording of this talk? Okay, so that's on the, by the way, the talk is outstanding, thank you. It is on the SEA website, Shoreline Education Awareness website. So you should be able to go there and find the recordings of this. Let's see.
I see a question from Richenda Fairhurst.
I'm kind of going down. Beth
Okay.
Mann asked, do you know the status of wave generated energy?
Yeah, Oregon State University has established a wave energy research park just off of Newport. And it's only been within the last month that they actually bored the cable landing for this wave energy park onto the coast. And it's right around Seal Rock up the coast a ways. Okay. So the purpose of that is to test this different wave energy devices. So it would be as a research park, but again, these things need to scale to size before they become of value. So you can test little models in a wave tank, and Oregon State has a fantastic big wave tank in their campus on Corvallis. but they're working to become a world leader and create a research center for what's called hydrokinetic energy or wave energy. It's the motion of the waves. And so they're they now will have a facility that they can anchor equipment at sea, hook it up to utility scale grid connections so that when they produce electricity, you can measure the scale of the electricity that they're making. But wave energy is a step behind floating offshore wind. And so there's Scotland is working on that. In the hydrokinetic realm, they're also working on tidal energy from currents. So around the coast of England, there's some very strong currents, and they're working to capture energy from fluid motion of the water. But that industry is still steps behind, and it will be years to decades until we see on the ground proposals to do utility scale wave parks. But should there be a breakthrough in wave, the energy density of moving water is much greater than the energy density of land. And so the devices that you use to collect that energy will be the same amount of energy, will be fewer in number and smaller in size.
Okay. Richard Fairhurst asked, when it comes to the need for a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, what goes at fastest, and what are the requirements for resources such as lithium, copper, nickel, and the balance for rapid transition? Does that make any difference for cost analysis of offshore wind versus large solar farms for rapid transition and necessary minerals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mentioned earlier that when they would talk about the cost of production, the cost of energy produced, I mentioned subsidies. The other thing that factors into the cost of energy produced and the speed at which it happens are tariffs. And the solar industry was subject to tariffs during the Trump administration. He worked with the local, with the US solar photovoltaic producers and put a very substantial tariff on the importation of solar panels that are made in China. The cost of solar panels has dropped dramatically and is actually starting to level off now. But if you're building a large utility scale solar farm, you need thousands of these solar panels. They have resource requirements, but for example, the copper requirements, the wire a solar array is not as intensive as wiring an offshore array. The conductors that you use are simple. By comparison, they don't need to be waterproof, or they don't need to have near the waterproof integrity that a deep sea cable does. And if you have a cable failure, it's much easier to get to. Solar farms can go up in a year. So you can really put a solar farm together quickly. One thing I didn't mention about all this that's really good for saving copper, and also doesn't require you to make a whole bunch of these big new substations, is just make your own electricity. You can put a solar, if you live in your own home and you have the means of doing so, you can just install, and you've got good light, you can install solar panels on your house, and you don't need to buy electricity from anyone. You just make it yourself. You can hook it to the grid, and when your solar panels aren't making electricity, you can then borrow electricity from the grid.
Cool. Okay, Heather Mann has her hand up. So Heather, you need to unmute yourself. There we go.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mike. It is great seeing you outside of a Coombs board meeting.
I'll say. It's coming up.
Yeah, I know. Hey, this is a fantastic presentation. You know, I have been digging into offshore wind pretty seriously over the last 2 years. And I was skeptical that I might learn something new in this presentation, but I have to say, I learned a lot that I didn't already know. So I just want to say up front, really great presentation. And clearly you put a lot of work into this research. So I just want to say that. For people that don't know me, I'm Heather Mann. I work for the Midwater Trawlers Cooperative. So basically I work for the commercial fishing industry. And the call areas that BOEM's identified off Oregon are 2,100 square miles of some of the most productive fishing grounds that we have. And those areas support millions of pounds of harvest worth, tens of millions of dollars to harvesters, processors, and the communities. And I'm really concerned that BOEM's not analyzing cumulative impacts up front. So you've done such a great job of showing, what 3 gigawatts requires in terms of turbines. But there's stuff going on in California. There's stuff upcoming in Washington. And those impacts are not analyzed. Neither are the impacts of getting to shore, getting that energy to shore and what that means. So I'm wondering, what is the role moving forward of people like you and groups like this? This is my first time at one of these seminars, but if you're educating folks, the docents and others, about how to talk to folks about offshore wind, where do the negative impacts to commercial fishing and recreational fishing and all that come into play in coastal communities? And I should have said up front, we are not against offshore development at all. It's really the siting is really critical, and being, how are all our voices heard in that process? And if you have ideas, Mike, on how we can be effective in voicing concerns and having an authentic seat at the table, like meaningful engagement, I'd really be interested in hearing about that. But great presentation. I'm really impressed.
Well, thanks, Heather. I'm thinking about this deeply as well. And I have been tracking the biology of this, although I haven't seen anyone discussing the dimensions that I presented this evening, and felt it was really important to raise that so that we actually have more than an artist rendering of what this stuff looks like, and how numerically, how it scales. One of the issues that I ran into, Heather, you mentioned, is we should think of this, if we're building something that's the size of 3 Bonneville dams in the ocean, in effect, what we're doing is we're extending the national grid into the sea. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates the operation and the development of the electrical transmission grid on land. But because there's no grid offshore and someone wants to build a power plant offshore, whose responsibility should it be to construct and operate the portion of the national grid that goes from the shoreline to a substation that's floating in the ocean? The Bonneville Power Administration is a public body. They were created by an act of Congress. So the substation and the power lines that they built between here and Los Angeles are publicly managed by a publicly appointed body. But what's happening now, the way offshore energy is being developed, there's nothing out there. And if you're a developer and you bid on one of these lease areas, your development plan is going to include making the power as well as processing it and delivering it to the existing grid. So in addition to seeing the privatization of the lease areas, we'll also see the privatization of the electrical distribution system. And what they're finding in Europe now, because Germany has dozens of these things and the UK has dozens of these things, and the North Sea is really loaded up with these turbines. So they found that once you start a template for development, And the first wind company builds their own substation that's sized to fit their power plant, and they build their own transmission line to shore and build their own substation on shore. When the second wind company comes and knocks on the door of the first wind company to say, hey, can we use your substation? It doesn't happen. And without advanced planning and discussion of who owns the transmission system, you will end up with every wave energy company up and down the coast wanting to bring their own transmission line to shore, wanting to build their own offshore substation, and wanting to build their own onshore substation. And some European countries are getting out in front of it finally, but it's very difficult to change if you have some players that operate their own system, and then suddenly the government comes in and wants to organize the things so that it's a little bit more efficient. So I think in the absence of policies, which we should be arguing for, there will be a proliferation of cable landings and substations and grid ties, and there will be a race to tie in and use up whatever existing grid capacity there is.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Lots to digest here, and I hope we can talk more after this. Thanks again.
Ongoing, we'll hear a lot more about it. I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I would remind people that this is recorded and you'll see it on the C website. So there's a lot of information to digest, and I think it's worthwhile reading it all again. It was excellent, excellent presentation, Mike.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And thanks again. Thank you all for your attention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.